Eric had always been a creature of habit. His days were simple, his routines predictable, and nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. That is, until the day he noticed something wrong with his shadow. It began innocently enough, just small things. He'd be walking through the living room, and out of the corner of his eye, he'd swear he saw his shadow move when he hadn't. But when he stopped and turned to look, it was perfectly normal, stretching behind him in the soft light. He shrugged it off as a trick of the light, or maybe the exhaustion from working long hours at the office. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. One evening, Eric was washing dishes in the kitchen, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Out of habit, he glanced down at his own shadow and froze. It was standing still, but he wasn't. His hands trembled as he stopped washing the plate, watching in disbelief as his shadow remained upright, as if it were still scrubbing the dish. Then with a sudden jerk, the shadow's arms moved, mimicking the actions he had just stopped. Eric's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, and this time his shadow didn't follow. It stood rooted in place, frozen in its mimicry of the task. He slowly walked out of the kitchen, watching the shadow from the corner of his eye. Just before he turned the corner, he saw it shift again, moving as though it had noticed him leaving. For the next few nights, Eric avoided the evening light, keeping his home brightly lit or staying in rooms without strong shadows. But it didn't help. The shadow began appearing where it shouldn't, standing in the hallway or lingering in the bathroom mirror behind him, even when there wasn't enough light to cast it. One night, after a particularly long day at work, Eric was sitting on the couch, trying to ignore the nagging sense of being watched. The TV flickered, casting soft light across the room. He glanced at the wall to see his shadow, except it wasn't just his shadow anymore. It was standing up. While Eric remained seated on the couch, his shadow stood, dark and tall, with long, spindly arms that stretched toward the ceiling. It didn't move, but its shape was wrong, twisted. Eric's chest tightened with fear as he realized he was no longer in control of it. "Stop," he whispered, unsure if he was talking to himself or the shadow. "Stop it." The shadow turned its head, or what should have been its head, and seemed to look at him. Slowly, deliberately, it began walking toward the far wall, its steps soundless. It slid across the floor, disappearing into the darker corner of the room. But Eric could still feel it there, watching, waiting. The next morning, Eric called in sick to work. He couldn't explain what was happening, and he didn't know who would believe him. All he knew was that his own shadow was no longer just a reflection of himself. It had taken on a life of its own. That night, as Eric lay in bed, the room was cloaked in darkness. He didn't dare turn on the lamp. He didn't want to see it. But just as his eyes began to flutter shut, he felt it, an icy, creeping sensation running up the side of his body. He looked down, and there it was. His shadow, no longer tied to his form, stood next to the bed, staring down at him with a featureless face. It raised its arm, and this time Eric couldn't move. His body felt heavy, pinned by an invisible weight. The shadow leaned in closer, its hand reaching out toward him. And then, in the softest whisper, it spoke. "I'm not your shadow anymore.